The sun had turned cruel hours ago, transforming from a welcome companion into a merciless overseer that pressed down upon Clara's shoulders like the weight of judgment itself. Each step forward sent small clouds of dust spiraling upward from the cracked earth, only to settle again on her torn skirts and dust-caked boots. The endless expanse of the American frontier stretched before her, a canvas of muted browns and pale yellows that seemed to swallow hope as easily as it swallowed sound. Clara Whitmore had been walking for 3 days now, though time had begun to lose meaning in this vast emptiness. The small bundle of belongings she carried, hastily packed in the dark hours before dawn when shame still clung to her like morning mist, had grown heavier with each mile. Inside the worn cloth were the remnants of a life she could never return to, a faded daguerreotype of her mother, a few coins that wouldn't last another week, and a letter she couldn't bring herself to read again. Behind her, somewhere in the shimmering heat waves that rose from the desert floor, lay the town of Millbrook. A place where whispers traveled faster than prairie wind and where a woman's reputation could be destroyed in the space between one Sunday service and the next. Clara had learned this truth in the hardest way possible, standing in the center of Main Street, while curious eyes peered from behind curtains and judgment fell upon her like stones. The memory made her stumble slightly, her worn boots catching on a ridge of hardened earth. She steadied herself with a hand pressed to her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her heart beneath her palm. Even here, miles from civilization, the shame followed her like a shadow that grew longer as the day wore on. She had fled in the pre-dawn darkness, when the world was painted in shades of gray and the only witness to her departure was the old dog that slept beneath the general store's porch. There had been no tearful goodbyes, no promises to write, no one to wave farewell from a doorway. In Millbrook, Clara Whitmore had become a cautionary tale, and cautionary tales were not bid farewell, they were simply erased. The frontier cared nothing for her story, just as it cared nothing for the stories of countless others who had walked these same paths in search of redemption, or escape, or simply a place where the past could not follow. The vastness was both terrible and merciful in its indifference. Here, beneath the endless dome of sky that seemed to press down with the weight of heaven itself, Clara was neither saint nor sinner. She was merely a small figure in a landscape that reduced all human drama to insignificance. As the afternoon wore on and shadows began their slow crawl eastward, Clara's steps grew more labored. The water in her canteen had been warm for hours, tasting of metal and desperation. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw from breathing dust. When she paused to take another careful sip, she noticed something that made her heart quicken, a thin line of green threading through the brown tapestry of the desert floor. Trees. Where there were trees, there was water. And where there was water, there might be people. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. People meant the possibility of shelter, food, work, survival. But people also meant questions, and questions were dangerous things when you carried secrets like stones in your pockets. Still, the alternative was to continue walking until the desert claimed her, and Clara had not come this far to surrender to the elements. She adjusted the bundle on her shoulder and pressed forward, following the green line as it gradually widened into what could generously be called a creek. The water was shallow and moved slowly, but it was clear and cold when she knelt beside it and cupped her hands for a drink. For the first time in days, she felt something approaching relief. The creek led her through a landscape that slowly transformed as the sun continued its westward journey. Sparse vegetation gave way to actual grass, and the occasional cottonwood tree offered blessed moments of shade. Clara began to see evidence of human presence. A fence post here, wheel ruts there, the skeleton of what might once have been a barn weathered gray by years of wind and sun. Then, as she crested a small rise, she saw it, a farmstead nestled in a shallow valley where the creek made a lazy curve. It was not much to look at, a small house built from rough-hewn logs, a barn that had seen better days, a few outbuildings that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the prairie. But to Clara, who had been walking toward an uncertain horizon for days, it looked like salvation itself. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and she could see movement in the yard, someone tending to evening chores. Clara paused at the crest of the hill, suddenly aware of how she must look, travel-stained, desperate, carrying the unmistakable air of someone running from something. The bundle in her arms felt heavier than ever, weighted down with shame and uncertainty. Below her, a figure emerged from the barn carrying a bucket. Even at this distance, Clara could see it was a man, tall and lean, moving with the careful economy of motion that marked someone accustomed to solitary work. He paused in his task and seemed to sense her presence, turning to look up the hill where she stood silhouetted against the dying light. For a long moment, neither moved. Clara felt the weight of his gaze across the distance, and even though she couldn't make out his features, she sensed something in his stillness that spoke of wariness, of someone else who understood that strangers could bring trouble as easily as they brought company. The smart thing would be to turn away, to continue walking until she found a town where questions might be easier to avoid. But Clara's feet were bleeding in her boots, her water was running low, and night was coming with the swift certainty of the desert. The smart thing and the necessary thing were not always the same. She began the descent into the valley, her footsteps raising small puffs of dust that seemed loud in the evening stillness. With each step, more details of the farmstead became clear. The house was small but well-maintained, with glass windows that reflected the last light of day. A vegetable garden stretched along one side, the plants wilting slightly in the heat but showing signs of careful tending. Chickens pecked in a fenced yard, and she could hear the low lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the barn. The man had set down his bucket and was watching her approach with the same careful stillness she had noticed from the hilltop. As she drew closer, Clara could see that he was indeed around her own age, perhaps a few years older, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of hard work and simple living. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by the kind of deep tan that came from years of outdoor labor. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Gray as storm clouds and holding the same wariness she felt in her own chest. Clara stopped at what seemed a respectful distance, suddenly unsure of how to begin. The conventions of polite society seemed absurd out here, but they were the only tools she had. "Good evening," she said, her voice hoarse from dust and disuse. "I'm sorry to trouble you." The man, Jonas, though she didn't know his name yet, studied her for a moment that stretched like taffy in the warm air. She could see him taking in her bedraggled appearance, the bundle clutched in her arms, the dust that coated her from head to toe. When he spoke, his voice was deep and careful, each word measured as if he were not accustomed to conversation. "You're a long way from anywhere," he observed. It was not quite a question, but Clara heard the inquiry beneath the statement. She lifted her chin slightly, calling on reserves of dignity she wasn't sure she still possessed. "Yes, I am. I wonder if you might spare some water from my canteen. I can pay." She watched his eyes flick to the coins she pulled from her pocket, a pitifully small collection that represented nearly all her remaining resources. Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't quite read what it was. "Water's free," he said simply. "Creek runs right past the house." He gestured toward the stream she had been following, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. Of course she could have filled her canteen from the creek. It hadn't occurred to her to simply help herself to what nature provided. She was still thinking like a woman from town, where everything had a price and permission was always required. "Thank you," she said, starting toward the water. "Miss," Clara turned back, raising her eyebrows in question. Jonas was studying her again, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. When he spoke, his words were slow and deliberate. "Going to be dark soon, and cold." Dessert gets cold at night, even in summer. It was not an invitation exactly, but Clara heard the possibility hidden in his observation. She also heard the reluctance, the internal struggle of a man clearly unaccustomed to company but unwilling to turn away someone in obvious need. "I'll be fine," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. "I've been managing." "Have you?" Again, it was not quite a question. Jonas picked up his bucket and started toward the house, then paused. "There's a lean-to behind the barn." "Dry. Blocks the wind." He didn't wait for her response, disappearing around the corner of the building with the same careful economy of movement she had noticed earlier. Clara stood alone in the gathering dusk, listening to the soft sounds of the farm settling into evening, the rustling of chickens, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees along the creek. She filled her canteen from the stream, the water so cold it made her teeth ache. Then she walked slowly toward the barn, following the directions Jonas had given her. The lean-to was exactly as he had described. a simple structure with 3 walls and a roof, clearly built for storing equipment, but empty now except for some old hay and a few farming tools hanging from hooks. It was clean and dry, and it would shield her from the wind that was already beginning to pick up as the temperature dropped. Clara set down her bundle and sank onto the hay, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her like a blanket. She had found shelter for the night, and water, and she was alive. For now, that was enough. But as she sat in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of Jonas completing his evening chores somewhere beyond the barn walls, Clara found herself wondering about the man who had offered her sanctuary. His reluctance had been obvious, but so had his unwillingness to turn her away. There had been something in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps, or the knowledge that came from carrying secrets of your own. The night sounds of the prairie began their ancient chorus, the yip of coyotes in the distance, the rustle of small creatures moving through the grass, the whisper of wind through the eaves of the barn. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to make herself comfortable on the hay. Tomorrow, she would need to make decisions about where to go next, but tonight, she was safe. And that was more than she had dared hope for when she crested the hill and saw smoke rising from the farmstead's chimney. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of whispered accusations and eyes that followed her down dusty streets. But each time Clara woke, the solid presence of the barn walls around her and the soft sounds of the sleeping farm served as anchors to reality. She was no longer in Millbrook. She was no longer the subject of pointed fingers and knowing looks. Here, in this isolated valley where a taciturn farmer had offered shelter to a stranger, she was simply a woman in need of rest. Dawn crept across the prairie with the slow patience of all desert mornings, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed almost too beautiful for the harsh landscape. Clara woke to the sound of roosters crowing and cattle moving restlessly in their pen, the everyday sounds of a working farm beginning its daily rhythm. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on hay, and peered around the edge of the lean-to. The farmyard was coming alive with purposeful activity. Jonas was already at work, moving between the barn and various outbuildings with the same careful efficiency she had observed the night before. He had not yet noticed she was awake, and Clara found herself studying him in the early morning light. He was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 25 or 26, but there was something about his bearing that spoke of experiences beyond his years. He moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to be self-sufficient, who expected no help and offered no unnecessary conversation. As she watched, he paused in his work to scratch behind the ears of a barn cat that had wound itself around his legs, and the small gesture revealed a gentleness that his taciturn manner had hidden. Clara rose and shook the hay from her skirts, trying to make herself as presentable as possible. When she emerged from the lean-to, Jonas looked up from the feed he was distributing to the chickens. Their eyes met across the yard, and for a moment neither spoke. "Morning," he said finally. "Good morning. Thank you for the shelter." He nodded once, as if her thanks were unnecessary. "Coffee's on the stove if you want some. Cups on the table." The offer surprised Clara. It implied an invitation into his house, into his private space. She hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate to accept such hospitality from a stranger, but the thought of hot coffee after days of lukewarm water from her canteen was almost irresistible. "That's very kind," she said. Jonas gestured toward the house with his chin. "Door's not locked." He returned to his feeding duties, leaving Clara to make her own way across the yard. The house was as modest inside as it appeared from without, a single large room that served as both kitchen and living area, with a ladder leading to what was presumably a sleeping loft. The furnishings were simple but well made. A wooden table and 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that radiated welcome warmth, shelves lined with books that surprised Clara with their number and variety. The coffee was strong and bitter and wonderful. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup and allowed herself a moment to simply enjoy the sensation of being inside, protected from the wind and dust of the prairie. Through the windows, she could see Jonas continuing his morning chores, and she found herself wondering about the life he had built here in this isolated valley. When he finally came inside, stamping the dust from his boots and hanging his hat on a peg by the door, Clara was struck again by the careful way he moved, as if he were constantly aware of taking up space that might be needed for something else. "More coffee?" she offered, rising from her chair. "I can get it." But Clara had already moved to the stove, refilling his cup with the automatic courtesy that had been drilled into her from childhood. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed briefly, and she noticed that his hands were calloused and scarred from years of hard work. They sat at his small table in silence, drinking coffee and listening to the sounds of the waking prairie filtering through the windows. It was not an uncomfortable silence. Indeed, Clara found it strangely restful after the charged atmosphere of whispers and speculation she had left behind in Millbrook. Here, silence was simply the natural state of things, not pregnant with unspoken accusations. "You heading somewhere in particular?" Jonas asked eventually. Clara stared into her coffee cup, considering her answer. The truth was that she had no destination in mind, only the need to put distance between herself and the life she had fled. But admitting that would invite questions she was not prepared to answer. "West," she said, which was both true and meaningless. Jonas nodded as if this answer satisfied him completely. "Long way to go on foot. I'll manage. Dessert's not forgiving to folks who aren't prepared for it." There was no judgment in his tone, only a statement of fact delivered with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had learned the prairie's lessons firsthand. Clara looked up from her coffee to find him watching her with those storm-gray eyes, and again she had the sense that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully, "but I'll be fine." "Will you?" It was becoming a pattern with him, Clara noticed, statements that sounded like questions, observations that carried implications he never quite voiced. She found it both infuriating and oddly comforting. In Millbrook, everyone had been eager to voice their opinions and suspicions. Here, Jonas seemed content to let her carry her secrets undisturbed. They finished their coffee in renewed silence, and Clara began to gather her things in preparation for departure. She had imposed on his hospitality long enough, and every moment she lingered increased the risk that he might ask questions she couldn't answer. "Thank you," she said, shouldering her bundle, "for the shelter and the coffee." "I won't forget your kindness." Jonas stood as she moved toward the door, and for a moment Clara thought he might say something more, but he simply nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. Clara had made it halfway across the yard when his voice stopped her. "Miss," she turned back, shading her eyes against the strengthening sun. "There's a town called Redemption about 30 miles west of here. Stage comes through twice a week." The information was offered without explanation or elaboration, but Clara understood its significance. 30 miles was a manageable distance, and a stage meant transportation to somewhere else, somewhere farther from Millbrook, and the whispers that had driven her into the desert. "Thank you," she said again. Jonas nodded once and turned back toward the barn, dismissing her as completely as if she had never existed. Clara watched him go, struck by the loneliness of his figure against the vast backdrop of the prairie. Then she set off walking west, following the faint track that served as a road in this isolated country. But she had gone no more than a mile when the heat began to assert itself with renewed intensity. The sun climbed higher, transforming the air into something that shimmered and wavered like water. Clara's pace slowed, and she found herself stopping more frequently to rest in whatever shade she could find. By midday, she was forced to acknowledge what Jonas had tried to tell her without actually saying it. She was not prepared for the desert. Her water was running low again. Her food consisted of a few pieces of hardtack that were already stale, and her boots were coming apart at the seams. 30 miles might as well have been 300. The realization came with a cold certainty that cut through the heat haze surrounding her. She was going to die out here, and it would be a stupid, preventable death. The kind of end that came to people who were too proud or too frightened to accept help when it was offered. Clara stopped walking and looked back the way she had come. The farmstead was no longer visible, hidden by the rolling contours of the prairie, but she knew it was there. A tiny island of civilization in an ocean of emptiness. Jonas had offered her shelter once. Would he do so again? The walk back seemed longer than her original departure, each step a small admission of defeat. The sun continued its merciless assault, and Clara found herself stumbling more frequently as exhaustion and dehydration took their toll. By the time the farmstead came into view again, she was lightheaded and unsteady on her feet. Jonas was working in the vegetable garden, bent over rows of beans that struggled against the harsh conditions. He looked up as Clara approached, and she saw no surprise in his expression, only the same careful watchfulness she had noticed before. She stopped at the edge of the garden, swaying slightly on her feet. Pride warred with necessity, and necessity won. "I don't suppose," she said, her voice hoarse with dust and exhaustion. That offer of shelter might extend to more than one night. Jonas straightened slowly, studying her flushed face and unsteady stance. He seemed to weigh her words carefully, and Clara held her breath while he considered his response. "Depends," he said finally. "On what?" "On whether you're running from the law." The directness of the question caught Clara off guard. She had expected polite inquiries about her circumstances, not this blunt assessment of potential danger. But she found herself respecting his pragmatism even as it made her uncomfortable. "No," she said, "not the law." Jonas nodded slowly, as if this distinction mattered to him. "Then I suppose you can stay until you figure out where you're going." Relief flooded through Clara with such intensity that she felt her knees buckle slightly. She gripped her bundle tighter to keep from falling and tried to maintain some semblance of dignity. "Thank you," she said. "I can work." "I won't be a burden." "Figured as much." Jonas returned to his beans, ending the conversation with the same abrupt efficiency that marked all his interactions. "Same arrangement as last night. Lean-to's yours if you want it." Clara made her way back to the shelter she had occupied the night before, this time with the knowledge that it would be hers for more than a single evening. She set down her bundle and sank onto the hay, finally allowing herself to acknowledge how close she had come to disaster. The desert had nearly claimed her, would have claimed her if not for the reluctant hospitality of a taciturn farmer who asked no questions and offered no judgments. As the day wore on, Clara found herself observing the rhythm of Jonas's work from her vantage point in the lean-to. He moved with the steady persistence of someone accustomed to solitary labor, tending to animals, maintaining equipment, and coaxing life from soil that seemed determined to resist cultivation. There was something almost meditative about his movements, as if the work itself provided a kind of peace that conversation could not. When evening came, Clara emerged from her shelter and approached the house hesitantly. She found Jonas at his kitchen table, eating a simple meal of beans and cornbread by the light of a single lantern. He looked up as she appeared in the doorway, and after a moment's hesitation, he gestured toward the second chair. "Might as well eat inside," he said. "Gets cold after sunset." Clara accepted the invitation gratefully, and soon found herself sitting across from Jonas, sharing his modest meal and listening to the comfortable sounds of the settling house. Neither felt compelled to fill the silence with conversation, and Clara found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced since leaving Millbrook. This became their pattern over the following days. Clara slept in the lean-to and took her meals at Jonas's table, contributing what she could to the household by tending the vegetable garden, collecting eggs from the chickens, and helping with other small tasks that didn't require specialized knowledge of farming. Jonas accepted her assistance with the same practical attitude he applied to everything else. Useful work was useful work, regardless of who performed it. They spoke little, but Clara began to sense the shape of her host's character through his actions rather than his words. He was methodical and careful, waste nothing, and valued self-sufficiency above comfort. His books revealed an educated mind. Volumes of poetry sat beside practical manuals on agriculture and animal husbandry, and Clara often saw him reading by lantern light in the evenings. Most telling of all was his obvious unfamiliarity with company. He moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture that might unexpectedly shift positions, and Clara realized that he had been alone in this valley for a very long time. The knowledge made her curious, but she had learned to value his restraint and did not pry. A week passed, then two. The routine of farm life began to feel natural to Clara, and she found herself settling into the rhythm of early mornings and hard work, followed by simple meals and quiet evenings. The constant anxiety that had driven her from Millbrook began to fade, replaced by a kind of cautious contentment she had not expected to find in such an isolated place. But even as her body healed from the ordeal of walking through the desert, Clara remained aware that her situation was temporary. Jonas had offered shelter, not permanence, and she could not impose on his hospitality indefinitely. The question of where to go next remained unanswered, a constant weight that no amount of routine could fully dispel. It was during her third week at the farmstead that Clara began to notice subtle changes in Jonas's behavior. He still maintained his careful distance and spoke only when necessary, but she caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't aware of his attention. There was something in his gaze during these moments, not the wariness she had grown accustomed to, but something else entirely. something that made her pulse quicken in ways she didn't entirely understand. The realization that she had begun to think of Jonas as more than simply a reluctant host came as a shock to Clara. She had fled Millbrook to escape the consequences of her last romantic entanglement, and the idea that she might be developing feelings for another man so soon seemed both foolish and dangerous. Yet she could not deny the way her heart lifted when she saw him working in the fields, or the comfort she felt sitting across from him at his kitchen table. One evening, as they shared their usual quiet meal, Clara found herself studying Jonas's profile in the lantern light. The harsh angles of his face had grown familiar to her, and she noticed details she had missed before. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of honest labor. "You're staring," he said, without looking up from his plate. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I was just thinking." "About what?" The question was asked in Jonas's usual matter-of-fact tone, but Clara sensed genuine curiosity beneath the words. She hesitated, unsure how to answer without revealing too much about the direction her thoughts had been taking. "About why you live out here alone," she said finally. "It must get lonely." Jonas set down his fork and looked at her directly for the first time since she had started studying his face. His gray eyes held an expression she couldn't quite read, something that might have been amusement or resignation. "You get used to it," he said. "Do you? Really?" It was Clara's turn to ask a question that carried implications she didn't quite voice. Jonas seemed to understand this because he was quiet for a long time before answering. Most of the time. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that neither seemed quite ready to explore. Clara felt her pulse quicken, aware that they were approaching territory that could change the careful equilibrium they had established. Part of her wanted to push further, to ask the questions that might reveal more about the man who had offered her sanctuary. But a larger part remained cautious, aware that some secrets were kept for good reasons. "What about you?" Jonas asked. "What were you thinking about when you decided to walk into the desert alone?" The question caught Clara off guard. In all the time she had been at the farmstead, Jonas had never directly asked about her circumstances or the reasons for her flight from civilization. She had grown comfortable with his lack of curiosity and now found herself unprepared to answer. "I was thinking about getting away," she said carefully. "From what?" Clara met his eyes across the small table, seeing in them the same careful watchfulness that had marked their first encounter. But there was something else there now, not judgment or suspicion, but a kind of recognition that made her breath catch. "From shame," she said, the words emerging before she could stop them. Jonas nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "That's a heavy load to carry." "Yes, it is." They looked at each other across the table, two people who had learned that the world could be both cruel and unforgiving, that sometimes the only choice was between running and surrendering entirely. In that moment, Clara felt something shift between them. Not the dramatic transformation of a romantic novel, but something subtler and perhaps more significant. A recognition of shared experience, of mutual understanding that went deeper than words. "Jonas," she said, his name feeling strange on her tongue after weeks of avoiding its use. "Yeah? Thank you. For letting me stay, for not asking questions." He was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he had decided not to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "We all got things we'd rather not talk about." The simple statement carried more weight than a longer explanation would have, and Clara felt something loosen in her chest, not the full release of her burden, but a slight easing of the pressure she had carried since fleeing Millbrook. Here, in this isolated farmstead where silence was valued over speculation, she had found something she hadn't dared hope for: acceptance without explanation, shelter without judgment. As the evening progressed and they completed their usual routine of cleaning up after dinner and preparing for the night ahead, Clara found herself hyper-aware of Jonas's presence. The small space of the house seemed charged with new electricity, every casual brush of their hands or meeting of their eyes carrying significance that hadn't existed before. When it came time to retire to their separate spaces, Jonas to his loft and Clara to her lean-to, she hesitated at the door, turning back to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Clara." It was the first time he had used her name, and hearing it in his deep, careful voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. She made her way to the lean-to in a daze, her mind replaying the evening's conversation and trying to parse the meaning of every word and gesture. Sleep was slow in coming that night. Clara lay on her bed of hay, listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie darkness and thinking about the man sleeping in the loft of the small house nearby. She had come here as a refugee seeking temporary shelter, but somewhere in the routine of shared meals and quiet companionship, something more complex had begun to develop. The realization should have frightened her. After all, it was romantic entanglement that had driven her from Millbrook in the first place. But instead, she felt a cautious hope that surprised her with its intensity. The next morning brought clouds that promised relief from the relentless sun, and with them a sense of anticipation that Clara couldn't quite name. She went about her usual tasks, collecting eggs, tending the garden, helping with the endless small maintenance that farm life required, but found herself more aware than usual of Jonas's movements and moods. He seemed different too, though the changes were subtle. He spoke a few words more than usual, allowed their hands to linger when passing tools or dishes, and Clara caught him looking at her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. It was as if the previous evening's conversation had opened a door that neither had been fully aware existed, allowing new possibilities to emerge in the space between them. The promised storm arrived in the late afternoon, sweeping across the prairie with the sudden violence that marked all weather in this vast landscape. Clara was in the lean-to when the first drops fell, heavy and warm and smelling of dust and ozone. She watched from her shelter as Jonas hurried to secure anything that might blow away, his movements quick and efficient as he battled the rising wind. Then the rain began in earnest, falling not in drops but in sheets that turned the dusty farmyard into a sea of mud within minutes. Clara pressed herself against the back wall of the lean-to as wind drove the rain horizontally, soaking everything in its path. The simple structure that had seemed adequate for normal weather suddenly felt fragile against the storm's fury. A gust of wind stronger than the others caught the lean-to's roof, lifting it slightly and sending a cascade of water directly onto Clara's makeshift bed. She grabbed her bundle and pressed herself into the corner, but it was clear that her shelter was no match for the storm's intensity. Through the driving rain, she saw Jonas emerge from the house, bent against the wind as he fought his way across the yard toward her. He reached the lean-to just as another gust threatened to tear the roof away entirely. "Come on!" he shouted over the wind, gesturing toward the house. "This won't hold." Clara hesitated for a moment, aware that accepting his offer meant crossing a line they had carefully maintained for weeks. But another gust of wind made the decision for her, nearly knocking her off her feet and sending her bundle flying across the lean-to. Jonas caught her arm as she stumbled, his grip strong and steady against the storm's chaos. Together, they battled their way across the muddy yard, arriving at the house soaked to the skin and breathless from their fight against the elements. Inside, the storm seemed less immediate but no less powerful. Rain drummed against the windows and roof with relentless intensity, and the wind howled around the corners of the house like something alive and angry. Clara stood dripping on Jonas's clean floor, suddenly aware of her bedraggled appearance and the impropriety of her presence in his private space. "I should go back," she said, though they both knew it was impossible. When the storm passes, Jonas was already moving toward a chest in the corner of the room, pulling out blankets and towels with the same practical efficiency he applied to all problems. Storm like this could last hours, maybe all night. He handed her a towel, carefully avoiding her eyes. "You should get out of those wet clothes. I'll turn around." Clara's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she could not deny the practical necessity of his suggestion. Her dress was soaked through and already beginning to chill her in the cooler air of the house. She accepted the towel and a blanket, and after a moment's hesitation, Jonas turned his back to give her privacy. The simple act of changing into dry clothes became charged with significance in the small space they now shared. Clara was acutely aware of Jonas's presence just a few feet away, of the sound of her wet dress hitting the floor, of the way the blanket felt against her bare skin. When she was decent again, wrapped in the rough wool like an improvised robe, she cleared her throat softly. "Thank you," she said. Jonas turned around, and Clara saw his eyes widen slightly as he took in her appearance. With her hair loose and damp around her shoulders and her body wrapped in the blanket, she looked entirely different from the composed woman who had been sharing his meals and working in his garden. More vulnerable, perhaps, but also somehow more present, as if the storm had washed away the careful barriers she maintained even in this isolated place. "Coffee?" he offered, his voice rougher than usual. Clara nodded, settling into one of the chairs at his small table while Jonas busied himself at the stove. The routine of making coffee seemed to ground him, giving him something to focus on besides the changed dynamic between them. But Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he moved to avoid coming too close to where she sat. The storm continued its assault on the small house, and as the evening wore on, it became clear that Clara would indeed be spending the night inside rather than in her usual shelter. The knowledge hung between them like the humidity that pressed against the windows, making every breath feel weighted with possibility and danger. They sat across from each other at the small table, nursing cups of coffee that had grown cold while the wind howled outside. The lantern cast shifting shadows on the walls, and every crack of thunder seemed to echo in the space between them. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, aware that beneath the rough wool she wore only her thin chemise and petticoat, an intimacy that felt both accidental and inevitable. "The storm will pass," Jonas said, breaking a silence that had stretched for nearly an hour. "Yes," Clara agreed, though she made no move to leave her chair or suggest alternative arrangements. Another hour passed, punctuated only by the storm's fury and the small sounds of their shared existence. The clink of cups being set down, the rustle of fabric when one of them shifted position, the soft exhalation of breath in the lamplit space. Clara found herself studying Jonas's face in the flickering light, memorizing the strong line of his jaw and the way shadows pooled in the hollow of his throat. When exhaustion finally forced the question of sleeping arrangements, it was Clara who spoke first. "I could take the floor," she offered, though every fiber in her being recoiled from the idea of leaving the warmth of his proximity. Jonas shook his head. "Take the bed. I'll sit up." "You can't sit up all night. Done it before." The simple statement carried implications that Clara didn't dare explore. Instead, she found herself rising from her chair and moving toward the ladder that led to his loft, the blanket trailing behind her like a makeshift train. She paused at the foot of the ladder, one hand on the rough wood, and looked back at Jonas. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen before, not the careful wariness that had marked their early interactions, nor the cautious friendship that had developed over their weeks together, but something rawer and more immediate. Something that made her breath catch and her pulse quicken. "Clara," he said, her name barely above a whisper. She waited, balanced between one moment and the next, between the safety of distance and the dangerous territory of closeness. But Jonas seemed to struggle with whatever he had meant to say, and after a long moment, he simply shook his head. "Good night," he said instead. "Good night." Clara climbed the ladder to his loft, her bare feet silent on the wooden rungs. The space above was small and intimate, dominated by a simple bed covered with quilts that smelled of sun and honest work. She settled onto the mattress, pulling the covers up to her chin, and listened to the sounds of Jonas moving around below. She could hear him banking the fire, checking the windows, performing the small rituals that marked the end of a day. But she could also hear the restless quality of his movements, the way he paused at the foot of the ladder as if considering climbing up to join her. The knowledge that only a few feet and a thin floor separated them made sleep seem impossible. But eventually, exhaustion won over awareness, and Clara drifted into dreams filled with storm sounds and the memory of gray eyes watching her across a lamplit table. She woke to find weak sunlight streaming through the loft's single window and the sound of quiet movement below. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed air and the drip of water from the eaves. Clara lay still for a moment, listening to Jonas prepare for his morning chores, and felt a sharp pang at the realization that their enforced closeness was over. When she climbed down from the loft, she found Jonas at the stove, his back turned as he cooked breakfast. He glanced over his shoulder as she descended, and Clara saw something new in his expression. Not regret exactly, but a kind of careful distance that hadn't been there the night before. "Morning," he said, his voice neutral. "Good morning." Clara accepted the plate he handed her and took her usual seat at the table, but the easy companionship of their previous meals seemed strained. They ate in silence, and Clara found herself searching for words to bridge whatever gap had opened between them during the night. "The lean-to probably needs repairs after the storm," she said finally. Jonas nodded. "I'll see to it." It was a dismissal, polite but firm, and Clara felt its weight settle in her chest like a stone. Whatever had passed between them during the storm's intimacy, Jonas clearly regretted it in the cold light of morning. She finished her breakfast quickly and excused herself to check on the garden, needing distance from the careful politeness that had replaced their growing ease with each other. The farmyard was a mess of mud and debris, testament to the storm's violence. Clara's lean-to had indeed suffered damage. Part of the roof had been torn away, and water stood in puddles on what had been her bed of hay. She began the work of cleaning up, grateful for the physical activity that kept her hands busy while her mind wrestled with disappointment she had no right to feel. She was wringing water from her blankets when Jonas appeared with an armload of lumber and tools. He worked methodically to repair the roof, and Clara found herself helping without being asked, holding boards in place while he hammered nails with sharp, efficient strikes. They worked well together, she realized. Their movements fell into an easy rhythm, anticipating each other's needs without discussion. It was a kind of intimacy in itself, built on shared labor and mutual understanding rather than words or touch. But it also felt fragile, as if one wrong move or careless comment might shatter the delicate balance they had achieved. "There," Jonas said, stepping back to survey his work. "Should hold through the next storm." Clara nodded her thanks, but didn't move toward the repaired shelter. Instead, she stood looking at the small space that had been her refuge for weeks, trying to imagine sleeping there after spending a night in the warmth of Jonas's loft. "Clara." She turned to find Jonas watching her with an unreadable expression. For a moment, she thought he might say something about the night before, might acknowledge the tension that had stretched between them like a wire ready to snap. But instead, he simply handed her the hammer he had been using. "Might want to keep this handy," he said. "Never know when repairs might be needed." It was such a mundane gesture, the lending of a tool, but Clara found herself treasuring it as if it were a declaration. In Jonas's careful world, practical consideration was perhaps the closest thing to tenderness he knew how to offer. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was both familiar and subtly changed. They maintained their routine of shared work and quiet meals, but underneath the surface, calm ran currents of awareness that neither acknowledged directly. Clara found herself hyper-conscious of Jonas's presence, of the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he worked, of the rare moments when his careful composure slipped to reveal something warmer underneath. For his part, Jonas seemed to be fighting his own battles with awareness. Clara caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, his gray eyes holding an intensity that made her pulse quicken. But whenever their eyes met directly, he would look away, rebuilding the careful distance that seemed to be his primary defense against the world. It was during the fourth day after the storm that Clara finally found the courage to address what lay between them. They had finished their evening meal and were sitting at the table, ostensibly reading. Jonas with a book of poetry, Clara with a farming manual she had borrowed from his shelf, but neither had turned a page in 20 minutes. "Jonas," she said, setting down her book. He looked up, wariness immediately visible in his expression. "About the night of the storm." "Nothing happened," he said quickly. "You needed shelter. I provided it. Nothing more." Clara felt her temper flare at his dismissal. "Nothing more? Is that what you tell yourself?" Jonas closed his book with deliberate care and set it aside. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but Clara could hear the tension beneath the surface. "What would you have me say, Clara? That I wanted you in my bed, that I spent the night listening to you breathe and thinking about things I have no right to think about?" The raw honesty of his words hit Clara like a physical blow. She had expected denial, perhaps anger at her persistence. But this admission of desire, delivered with such stark simplicity, left her breathless. "Jonas, you're here because you're running from something. And whatever it is, it's not my business to know. But it is my business to remember that you're not staying. You're passing through, same as everyone else who's ever ended up in this valley. And I'm not fool enough to pretend otherwise." The words stung because they carried too much truth. Clara had indeed been running, and despite the contentment she had found in their routine, she had never explicitly stated an intention to stay permanently. But hearing Jonas frame their relationship in terms of her inevitable departure made her realize how much she had begun to hope for something different. "What if I wanted to stay?" she asked quietly. Jonas went very still. "Do you?" Clara met his eyes across the table, seeing in them a vulnerability that his careful words had tried to hide. "I don't know. Maybe. If there was a reason to." And what reason would that be? The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities that neither seemed quite brave enough to voice. Clara felt her heart racing as she considered her answer, aware that her next words might change everything between them, or end it entirely. You, she said simply. You would be the reason. Jonas stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm not much of a reason for anything, Clara. I'm just a man trying to make a living from land that doesn't want to give it up. I don't have much to offer except work and silence and more of the same. Maybe that's enough, Clara replied. Maybe work and silence are exactly what I need. Jonas shook his head. You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what you'd be choosing. Then tell me. The challenge lay between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Clara could see Jonas wrestling with her demand, his habitual reticence warring with something deeper and more urgent. When he finally began to speak, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something precious. I came here 8 years ago, he said, running from something same as you. Difference was, what I was running from had a name and a badge and the law on his side. Clara felt her breath catch, but she didn't interrupt. Jonas was looking past her now, his eyes focused on something only he could see. There was a woman back in Kansas. Sarah. I thought I loved her, thought she loved me back. Turned out she loved my brother better, and when her father found out, he blamed me for corrupting her virtue. Said I'd forced myself on her. Jonas's laugh was bitter. Maybe she even believed it by the end. People have a way of rewriting history to suit their needs. The story was painfully familiar to Clara, echoing her own experience with cruel accuracy. She wanted to reach across the table, to offer comfort or understanding, but something in Jonas's posture warned her to stay still. Her father was the territorial judge, Jonas continued, had the sheriff in his pocket and half the men in town besides. I could have stayed and fought the charges, might even have won in the end. But Sarah had already moved on to my brother, and the whole thing felt poisoned from the start. So I took what I could carry and came west. And you've been here ever since. 8 years next month. 8 years of no visitors, no questions, no complications. Just me and the land and the work that keeps me too tired to think about anything else. Jonas finally looked at her again, and Clara saw in his eyes the pain that his careful words had tried to minimize. That's what you'd be choosing, Clara. A man who spent 8 years learning not to trust anyone, not to want anything beyond what he can make with his own hands. A man who's forgotten how to be anything except alone. Clara absorbed his words in silence, understanding now the source of his careful distance and his reluctance to acknowledge what had been growing between them. But instead of discouraging her, his honesty only strengthened her resolve. What if I told you I understand, she said. What if I said I've been running from something remarkably similar? Jonas's eyes sharpened. What do you mean? Clara took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to reveal would either bring them together or drive them permanently apart. There was a man in Millbrook, the banker's son. He convinced me he loved me, that he wanted to marry me. And I believed him, because I wanted so badly to be loved that I ignored every warning sign. The words came easier now, as if sharing Jonas's burden had lightened her own. When his father found out about our association, there was no talk of marriage anymore. Suddenly, I was the one who had seduced him, who had used feminine wiles to trap an innocent young man. And when the whole town turned against me, he stood by and let them do it. So you left. I fled in the middle of the night like a thief. Left everything I'd ever known because I couldn't bear to stay in a place where everyone saw me as something I wasn't. Jonas nodded slowly, and Clara could see him processing her revelation, fitting it into his understanding of who she was and why she had arrived in his valley dusty and desperate. We make quite a pair, he said finally. Yes, Clara agreed. We do. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared confession settling between them. Outside, the night sounds of the prairie provided a familiar soundtrack to their contemplation, but inside the small house, the air felt charged with new possibilities. Clara, Jonas said eventually. Yes? If you stayed, and I'm not saying you should, but if you did, it wouldn't be easy. This life, this place, it's hard on people, hard on women especially. Clara considered his warning, thinking of the comfortable life she had left behind in Millbrook. The social gatherings, the conveniences of town living, the community of women who had been her friends before they became her judges. "I've discovered I'm stronger than I thought," she said, "and I've also discovered that easy isn't necessarily better." Jonas studied her face in the lamplight, as if trying to read her sincerity in her expression. "And the isolation? The silence? What happens when you get tired of talking only to me and the chickens?" Clara felt a smile tug at the corners of her mouth. "I've grown rather fond of the chickens, actually. They're excellent listeners, and they never gossip." It was a small joke, but Jonas's answering smile transformed his entire face. For just a moment, the careful guard he maintained slipped away, revealing someone younger and more hopeful than the man Clara had come to know. "They do have their virtues," he agreed. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Clara found herself holding her breath, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter whatever understanding they were building. But Jonas seemed to sense her caution because he remained perfectly still as well, neither advancing nor retreating. "Jonas," she said softly. "Yeah? Why did you let me stay?" "Really?" It was the question she had been wanting to ask for weeks, the one that went deeper than practical considerations of shelter and safety. Jonas was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible above the night wind. "Because no one else ever let me." Part 2. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, visible and vital and impossible to call back. Clara felt something shift deep in her chest. Not the dramatic transformation of her girlish fantasies, but something quieter and more profound. The recognition of a kindred spirit, perhaps, or the simple acknowledgement that loneliness shared became something different than loneliness endured alone. Jonas looked stricken as soon as the words left his mouth, as if he had revealed more than he intended. He started to rise from his chair, probably to flee to the barn or some other refuge where he could rebuild his carefully constructed walls. But Clara's voice stopped him before he could take a step. "Sit down," she said quietly. "Please." He hesitated, caught between flight and surrender. Clara could see the war playing out in his expression, the impulse to retreat battling against something deeper that wanted to stay, to see where this moment might lead them. "Please," she repeated, and this time he sank back into his chair. The silence that followed was different from their usual comfortable quiet. This silence thrummed with tension and possibility, with words that wanted to be spoken and gestures that wanted to be made. Clara found herself memorizing the details of Jonas's face in the lamplight, the way shadows pooled beneath his cheekbones, the silver threads she was just beginning to notice in his dark hair, the vulnerability that made him look younger despite the weathering of sun and wind. "I need to tell you something," Clara said eventually, "about why I really stayed." Jonas waited, his gray eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "It wasn't just because I had nowhere else to go. It was because of the way you looked at me that first day, like I was a person instead of a problem, like I deserved help without having to explain why I needed it." She paused, searching for words that could convey the depth of what she had felt during those first desperate days. "In Millbrook, I became invisible after the scandal. Not ignored. Ignored would have been a mercy. I became a specter that people saw only long enough to judge. But you saw me as I was, and you offered shelter anyway." "Clara, let me finish." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I know you think I'm here because I'm running from something. And that's true, partly. But I'm also here because I'm running toward something. Toward the possibility of being known without being condemned. Toward the idea that maybe shame doesn't have to be permanent." Jonas was very still, his hands flat on the table between them. "And what if you're wrong? What if this is just another mistake in a long line of mistakes?" "Then I'll make it honestly," Clara replied, "with someone who understands what it means to carry regret." The conviction in her voice seemed to surprise them both. Clara had not realized until she spoke the words how deeply she meant them, how completely her perspective had shifted during her weeks at the farmstead. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Millbrook in the dark of night. Something in the rhythm of farm life, in the honest simplicity of Jonas's company, had given her back a sense of her own worth. "You don't know me," Jonas said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Not really. You know the man who does chores and shares meals and keeps his mouth shut. You don't know what I was like before I came here. What I might be like again if the wrong circumstances presented themselves." Clara leaned forward slightly, closing some of the distance between them. Then tell me. Help me know you. Jonas shook his head. Some things are better left buried. Are they? Or do buried things just fester in the dark until they poison everything around them? The question struck home. Clara could see it in the way Jonas's jaw tightened, in the brief flash of pain that crossed his features. She pressed her advantage gently, aware that she was asking him to trust her with wounds that had never fully healed. I told you about Millbrook, she said, about the banker's son and the shame that drove me into the desert. What is it you're afraid to tell me? Jonas was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands where they lay folded on the table. When he finally began to speak, his voice was so low that Clara had to lean forward to hear him. Sarah wasn't the first woman who claimed I'd forced my attentions, he said. There was another, 3 years earlier, a preacher's daughter who said I'd cornered her behind the church after Sunday service. Clara felt her stomach clench, but she kept her expression neutral. What happened? Nothing happened. That was the problem. She'd been making eyes at me for weeks, following me around, finding excuses to talk to me. And I was young and stupid enough to think it meant something. So when she suggested we meet behind the church to talk privately, I went. Jonas's hands had tightened into fists without him seeming to realize it. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. She was standing close the way women do when they want you to kiss them. So I did. 1 kiss, maybe 2. Nothing more than that. But when her father found us, she started crying and claiming I'd grabbed her, tried to force her dress up. And people believed her? Preacher's daughter doesn't lie, especially not about something like that. I was lucky they didn't run me out of town on a rail. As it was, I couldn't walk down Main Street without getting spat at for months. Clara absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the careful, gentle man she had come to know. But you stayed. I stayed because I was too stubborn to run from a lie, and because I thought time would prove the truth. Jonas's laugh was bitter. Shows how much I knew about human nature. Time doesn't prove anything except that people prefer their stories simple and their villains obvious. Is that what happened with Sarah? She needed a simple story? Jonas nodded slowly. Sarah needed to explain why she'd been meeting a man in secret without being engaged to him. And when her father found out, she needed someone to blame besides herself. I was convenient. Clara could hear the years of pain compressed into those simple words, the weight of being used as a convenient scapegoat, not once, but twice. No wonder Jonas had retreated to this isolated valley, choosing silence over the risk of further accusations. I'm not Sarah, she said quietly, and I'm not the preacher's daughter. Jonas looked up at her then, his gray eyes searching her face. How do I know that? How does anyone ever know that? It was a fair question, and Clara found herself without a simple answer. How did anyone learn to trust after betrayal? How did anyone risk vulnerability after being used and discarded? I suppose you don't know, she admitted. Not for certain. Trust isn't something you can prove in advance. It's something you discover by taking chances. And if I'm wrong about you? If you decide one day that this life isn't what you wanted after all? Clara considered the question seriously, understanding that her answer would carry weight beyond the immediate moment. Then I'll leave honestly, with gratitude for what we had instead of lies about what we didn't. But I won't use you as the villain in someone else's story. Jonas studied her face for a long moment, and Clara could see him weighing her words against his experience, his hope against his caution. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tentative quality she had never heard before. And what is it you think we might have? The question was both invitation and challenge, asking Clara to articulate what had been growing between them in the spaces between words and work. She felt her pulse quicken as she considered her answer, aware that this conversation was approaching a threshold that would change everything. I think we might have a chance, she said carefully. A chance to be known for who we are instead of what we've been accused of being. A chance to build something honest in a place where no one's watching or judging. And if that's all it is? Just a chance with no guarantees? Clara met his eyes steadily. Then that's more than either of us had before. Jonas was quiet again, but Clara could sense a shift in his stillness. Less defensive now, more receptive. The wall he maintained between himself and the world seemed to be developing cracks, letting in possibilities he had spent years holding at bay. Clara, he said eventually. Yes? If we do this, if we try this thing, it has to be real. No pretending, no pretty lies to make it easier. I can't survive another false start. I understand. I'm not easy to live with. I've been alone too long, got too set in my ways. I don't know how to share space with another person anymore. Clara felt a smile tug at her lips. I've been living in your lean-to for weeks, Jonas. I think I have some idea of your habits. That's different. You were a guest then. This would be... He trailed off, unable or unwilling to name what this would be. Clara understood his hesitation. They were approaching territory that neither had explicit experience with, despite their respective romantic disasters. This would be us, she said simply. Two people who've learned to be careful, learning to be careless with each other. Jonas absorbed her words, and Clara could see them working their way through his careful defenses. When he looked at her again, there was something new in his expression. Not the vulnerability she had glimpsed before, but something steadier. Something that looked almost like hope. You'd really stay? He asked. Give up whatever life you might find in a real town, with real people and real opportunities? Clara considered the question, thinking of the life she had left behind and the unknown possibilities that might await her further west. Then she thought of morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, of the satisfaction of work done well, of the way Jonas's rare smiles transformed his entire face. Real people haven't been particularly kind to either of us, she pointed out. And as for opportunities, well, I think there might be opportunities here too, if we're brave enough to take them. Jonas nodded slowly, as if her answer had settled something that had been weighing on him. It won't be easy, he said again. I'm not looking for easy anymore, Claire replied. I'm looking for honest. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation settling around them like dust after a storm. Clara found herself studying Jonas's hands, where they rested on the table, noting the calluses and scars that spoke of years of honest labor. They were good hands, she thought. Hands that built things instead of tearing them down. That offered help without expecting payment. So what happens now? She asked eventually. Jonas seemed to consider the question carefully. Now we take it slow. See if what we think we feel survives the everyday reality of sharing a life. And if it does? For the first time since Clara had known him, Jonas allowed himself to smile with something approaching genuine happiness. Then I guess we'll figure out the rest as we go along. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the sight of that smile, at the promise it contained. They had a long way to go, she knew. Trust was not built in a single conversation, and the habits of solitude would not be easily overcome. But they had taken the first step, and that felt like more than either of them had dared hope for. The next few days passed with a new awareness humming between them, as if the air itself had become more charged. They maintained their usual routines, shared meals, divided labor, quiet evenings, but underneath the familiar patterns ran currents of possibility that changed everything. Clara found herself hyper-conscious of Jonas's presence in ways that were both thrilling and unsettling. The brush of his fingers when he passed her a tool, the sound of his voice calling her name across the farmyard, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Every interaction felt weighted with significance. For his part, Jonas seemed to be fighting his own battles with awareness. Clara caught him starting to speak several times, only to stop himself and return to work with renewed intensity. The careful distance he had maintained for weeks was clearly costing him more effort now, as if their conversation had weakened his defenses against whatever he was feeling. It was Clara who finally broke the pattern of careful avoidance. They had finished their evening meal and were sitting at the table, ostensibly reading but really just stealing glances at each other when they thought it was safe. The tension had become almost unbearable, and Clara found herself setting down her book with more force than necessary. "This is ridiculous," she said. Jonas looked up, startled. "What is this tiptoeing around each other like we're afraid of breaking something? We've had the conversation, Jonas. We've made the decision. So why are we still acting like strangers?" Jonas closed his own book slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Because I don't know how to act any other way. It's been 8 years since I shared my life with another person, Clara. I'm out of practice." "Then let's practice," Clara said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Let's start small and work our way up to the bigger things." "What did you have in mind?" Clara felt her cheeks warm, but she pressed forward. "Start by saying my name without looking like it might catch fire. Look at me when we're talking instead of staring at your hands. Sit closer than arm's length when we're reading." The suggestions were simple, almost childish, but Jonas considered them with the seriousness he applied to all problems. After a moment, he stood up from his chair and moved to sit beside Clara instead of across from her. The gesture brought them close enough that she could smell the soap he used, could see the small scar above his eyebrow that she had noticed weeks earlier. "Clara," he said, her name deliberate and careful on his tongue. "Better," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way her pulse had quickened at his proximity. They sat side by side, neither reading, both acutely aware of the space between them that was measured in inches rather than feet. Clara could feel the warmth radiating from Jonas's body, could hear the slightly uneven rhythm of his breathing. When she glanced sideways, she found him looking at her with an expression that made her stomach flutter. "Now what?" he asked. Clara considered the question, aware that they were approaching territory that was both dangerous and necessary. Physical proximity was one thing. Emotional intimacy was quite another, and she wasn't sure either of them was ready for the full implications of what they were attempting. "Now we get used to this," she said, "to being close without having to justify it or apologize for it." Jonas nodded, settling back in his chair with visible effort at relaxation. They sat in silence for a while, both pretending to read while really just adjusting to the new reality of shared space. Clara found herself hyper-aware of every small movement Jonas made, the way he turned pages, the soft sound of his breathing, the occasional shift of his position that brought his shoulder closer to hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "It's been a long time since I sat this close to anyone. Are you uncomfortable?" Jonas considered the question. "No. Nervous, maybe, but not uncomfortable." Clara understood the distinction. This new closeness felt both natural and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you wanted to jump. The fear was real, but so was the exhilaration. "We don't have to rush anything," she said. "We have time to figure this out." "Do we?" Jonas turned to look at her directly, and Clara was struck by the intensity in his gray eyes. "How do I know you won't change your mind? Decide this was all a mistake and disappear one morning before I wake up." The fear in his voice was raw and immediate, and Clara realized that her own anxieties about trust and commitment were matched by his terror of abandonment. He had been alone for so long that the prospect of losing companionship once he had found it again must seem almost unbearable. "Because I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "Because I've found something here that I didn't even know I was looking for, and I'm not foolish enough to throw it away." "And what's that?" Clara turned to face him more fully, studying his face in the lamplight. "Peace," she said simply. "For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe without worrying about what people might think or say. Like I can be myself without apology or explanation." Jonas absorbed her words in silence, and Clara could see them working their way through his careful defenses. When he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that made her chest tighten. "I feel that too," he admitted. "Like maybe I don't have to carry all my mistakes alone anymore." The admission hung between them, precious and fragile. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness but from relief at hearing her own feelings reflected in his words. They were both damaged, both carrying scars from trust betrayed and love turned weapon. But perhaps, together, they might find a way to heal. Without thinking about it, Clara reached out and touched Jonas's hand where it rested on his knee. The contact was light, barely there, but Jonas went completely still as if her touch had the power to break him apart or put him back together. "Clara," he said, her name barely a whisper. She didn't move her hand, but she didn't increase the pressure either. This was as much contact as either of them could handle right now, she realized. Any more would send one or both of them fleeing back to the safety of distance. They sat that way for a long time, Clara's fingers resting lightly on Jonas's hand, both of them hardly daring to breathe. Outside, the night sounds of the prairie provided a familiar soundtrack, but inside the small house, the world had narrowed to the space between them and the careful miracle of trust beginning to grow. When Clara finally withdrew her hand, Jonas made a small sound that might have been protest or relief. She settled back in her chair, but didn't move away from him. The physical distance between them was still minimal, and she could feel the warmth of his body like a promise beside her. "Thank you," Jonas said quietly. "For what?" "For staying. For taking a chance on this. For not running when I told you about Sarah and the preacher's daughter." Clara turned to look at him, seeing in his profile the pain that his confession had cost him. "Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't." But it was necessary. You deserve to know what you might be getting into. And now I do, Clara said. And I'm still here. Jonas nodded, and Clara could see some of the tension leave his shoulders. They had crossed another threshold, she realized. Not the dramatic transformation of a romantic story, but the quieter, more profound shift that came from mutual understanding. The days that followed brought a new ease to their interactions, as if the careful groundwork they had laid was finally beginning to bear fruit. Clara found herself moving through the routines of farm life with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. The work remained hard, tending animals, maintaining equipment, coaxing life from reluctant soil, but it no longer felt like mere survival. It felt like building something, creating a life that was theirs together. Jonas, too, seemed to be emerging from the careful shell he had constructed around himself. He spoke more freely now, sharing observations about the weather or the behavior of the animals that went beyond simple necessity. Clara treasured these small revelations, understanding that each one represented a deliberate choice to include her in his world. It was during the second week after their watershed conversation that Clara first noticed the dust cloud on the horizon. She had been hanging laundry on the line behind the house, enjoying the morning breeze that carried the scent of growing things and clean earth. The speck of movement in the distance caught her eye, too large to be a dust devil, too purposeful to be wind-blown debris. Riders. Multiple horses, moving with the steady pace of men who knew their destination. Clara felt her stomach drop as she watched the dust cloud grow larger. In all her weeks at the farmstead, they had seen no other human beings, had existed in a bubble of isolation that had felt like protection. Now that bubble was about to burst, and Clara found herself paralyzed by the implications. Who would be riding toward an isolated farm in the middle of nowhere? What possible business could strangers have with Jonas, or, more terrifyingly, with her? She dropped the shirt she had been hanging and ran toward the barn where Jonas was repairing a broken harness. He looked up as she burst through the doorway, immediately alert to the distress in her expression. "Riders," she said breathlessly, "coming from the east, maybe 4 or 5 of them." Jonas set down his tools with deliberate care, but Clara could see the tension that immediately coiled through his body. He moved to the barn door and peered out across the prairie, his gray eyes fixed on the approaching dust cloud. "Too far to make out details," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Could be anyone." But Clara could hear the lie in his words, could see the wariness that had settled over his features like a mask. In their isolated valley, unexpected visitors were rarely bearers of good news. "What do we do?" she asked. Jonas was quiet for a moment, his gaze still fixed on the approaching riders. When he turned to look at Clara, she was startled by the intensity in his expression. "Depends on what they want," he said, "and who they're looking for." The implication hung heavy between them. Clara felt her mouth go dry as she considered the possibilities. Had someone from Millbrook tracked her down? Had word of her presence somehow reached the outside world despite their careful isolation? "Jonas, get inside," he said, cutting her off. "Stay away from the windows until we know what this is about." Clara nodded and started toward the house, but Jonas's voice stopped her. "Clara!" She turned back, noting the rifle he had pulled from its rack by the barn door. The sight of the weapon made the danger suddenly, viscerally real. "If this goes badly," Jonas said, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words, "there's a root cellar behind the house. Stone-lined, hard to find if you don't know where to look. You can hide there until they're gone." "I'm not hiding while you face whatever this is alone." Jonas's jaw tightened. "You are, if I tell you to. This is my land, my problem. I won't have you hurt because of something that might not even concern you." Clara wanted to argue, to insist that they face whatever was coming together, but the look in Jonas's eyes brooked no disagreement. He had spent 8 years learning to handle trouble alone, and the habit was too ingrained to break now. She made her way to the house as instructed, but instead of staying away from the windows, she positioned herself where she could watch the approaching riders through a gap in the curtains. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the dust cloud resolved into individual figures, 5 men on horseback, riding with the purposeful intensity of a posse. Clara's blood turned to ice as she recognized the lead rider. Sheriff Morrison from Millbrook, his badge glinting in the morning sunlight. Behind him rode 4 deputies, all armed, all wearing the grim expressions of men on official business. They had found her. Somehow, impossibly, They had tracked her across hundreds of miles of empty prairie to this isolated farmstead. Clara felt her knees buckle, and she gripped the windowsill for support as the full implications crashed over her. They wouldn't have come all this way just to drag her back to face social ostracism. If Sheriff Morrison was here with a full posse, it meant charges had been filed. It meant someone, probably the banker or his son, had decided that ruining her reputation wasn't punishment enough. Clara's mind raced as she tried to think of what she could be charged with. Theft? Adultery? Some trumped-up accusation designed to justify the expense and effort of this pursuit? It didn't matter, she realized. In the end, it didn't matter what they claimed she had done. What mattered was that her presence here had brought danger to Jonas, had shattered the peace he had built for himself in this remote valley. She watched through the window as the posse approached the farmyard, noting how they spread out in a loose formation that would make escape difficult. Sheriff Morrison raised his hand to call a halt just outside the barn, his eyes scanning the buildings and yard with professional assessment. Jonas emerged from the barn, the rifle held casually but ready. Clara could see the careful neutrality he had adopted, the same mask of polite distance he had worn when she first stumbled into his valley. But now she could read the tension beneath the facade, could see the way his grip tightened on the rifle despite his relaxed posture. "Morning," Jonas called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "You gentlemen seem to be a long way from anywhere." Sheriff Morrison dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. Clara could see him taking in the details of the farmstead, cataloging potential hiding places and escape routes with the practiced eye of a lawman. "Morning," Morrison replied. "Name's Sheriff Morrison out of Millbrook. We're looking for someone, and we have reason to believe she might have passed through this area." Clara felt her heart stop as Morrison produced a piece of paper from his vest pocket. A wanted poster, she realized, with her name and probably her description. The sight of it made her legs weak with terror and rage. They had actually made her a wanted criminal. They had reduced her entire existence to a few lines of text and a crude sketch. "Someone?" Jonas repeated, his tone carefully neutral. "A woman named Clara Whitmore. About 22 years old, brown hair, brown eyes. She fled Millbrook about a month ago under suspicious circumstances." Jonas was quiet for a moment, and Clara held her breath as she waited for his response. He could turn her over right now, she realized. Could end this standoff without violence or complications simply by admitting she was there. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Why should he risk everything for a woman he had known for only a few weeks? "Can't say the name rings a bell," Jonas said finally. "Don't get many visitors out here." Clara felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. He was protecting her, despite the danger it put him in, despite the fact that cooperation would be simpler and safer. Morrison studied Jonas with the sharp attention of a man accustomed to detecting lies. "Mind if we take a look around? Just to be thorough." "Actually, I do mind," Jonas replied, his voice hardening slightly. "This is private property, Sheriff." "You got a warrant to be searching it?" "Don't need a warrant to pursue a fugitive, son." "And Miss Whitmore is wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of a considerable sum of money from the Millbrook First National Bank." Clara felt the world tilt around her. Theft? They were accusing her of theft? The accusation was so absurd, so completely fabricated, that for a moment she couldn't process it. Then the full implications hit her like a physical blow. They weren't here to drag her back for social rehabilitation. They were here to arrest her for a serious crime. A crime that could see her hanged if they decided to push it that far. "That's a serious accusation," Jonas said, and Clara could hear the careful control in his voice. "What makes you think this woman would have come all the way out here?" Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. "Process of elimination, mostly. We've checked every town and settlement within 100 miles of Millbrook. This is about the only place left she could be hiding." One of the deputies spoke up, his voice rough with the dust of long travel. "Enough talking, Sheriff. Let's search the place and be done with it." "Now hold on," Jonas said, shifting the rifle to a more obviously ready position. "I told you this is private property. You want to search it? You come back with proper papers." The tension in the farmyard ratcheted up several notches. Clara could see the deputies shifting restlessly in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. Sheriff Morrison's expression had hardened into the mask of official authority that brooked no opposition. "Son, I'm going to give you one chance to reconsider," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of implied threat. "Interfering with a lawful investigation is a serious matter. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." Clara watched the standoff unfold with growing terror. 5 armed men against one, and all because of her. All because she had brought her troubles to Jonas's door, like a curse disguised as salvation. She couldn't let this happen. Couldn't let Jonas risk everything for someone who had already proven to be nothing but trouble. The smart thing, the right thing, would be to walk out of the house and surrender herself to Morrison's custody. It would save Jonas, would end this confrontation before it could escalate into violence. But even as the thought formed in her mind, Clara found herself unable to move. Not from cowardice, but from a deeper understanding of what surrender would mean. Morrison hadn't come all this way just to ask questions about missing money. He had come to tie up loose ends, to silence the woman who knew too much about the banker's son and his father's willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their family's reputation. If she went with them, she would never see trial. There would be an accident during transport, a desperate escape attempt that ended badly. A dozen ways to ensure that Clara Whitmore's inconvenient truth died with her in the wilderness. Jonas seemed to sense her presence at the window because he glanced briefly toward the house. In that moment of eye contact, Clara saw something that made her breath catch. Not fear or resignation, but a kind of grim determination that spoke of decisions already made. "I'll ask you one more time to leave," Jonas said, his attention returning to Morrison. "This is my land, and you're not welcome here." Morrison's hand dropped to his gun. "And I'll ask you one more time to step aside and let us do our job." The moment balanced on a knife's edge. 5 seconds of perfect tension where anything could happen and probably would. Clara found herself holding her breath, aware that the next word spoken would determine whether this ended in surrender or gunfire. It was Jonas who broke the silence, his voice carrying across the farmyard with quiet finality. "Then I reckon we've got a problem, Sheriff, because I'm not moving." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gun not yet fired. Clara felt tears track down her cheeks as she understood what Jonas was offering. Not just protection, but a kind of faith that stole her breath with its simple enormity. He was choosing her, choosing to stand against 5 armed men rather than give her up to face charges they both knew were fabricated. Choosing to risk everything he had built in this isolated valley for a woman he had known for less than 2 months. Sheriff Morrison's face darkened with anger and frustration. "Have it your way, son. But you're making a big mistake." He gestured to his deputies, and Clara watched in growing horror as the men began to spread out around the farmyard, positioning themselves for what could only be an assault on the house. They moved with practiced efficiency, covering angles and escape routes with the coordination of men who had done this before. Jonas backed slowly toward the house, keeping the rifle trained on Morrison while watching the deputies from the corner of his eye. Clara could see the calculation in his movements, the way he positioned himself to have the best possible defensive position when the shooting started. Because it would start, she realized. Too much had been said, too many lines drawn. Morrison couldn't back down now without losing face, and Jonas had made it clear he wouldn't surrender without a fight. Clara made her decision in that moment of clarity. She couldn't let Jonas die for her, couldn't let his blood water the soil of the valley that had given them both sanctuary. If someone was going to pay the price for her past mistakes, it should be her. She moved away from the window and toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. But before she could open it, Jonas's voice cut through the morning air with startling clarity. "Clara!" She froze, her hand on the door latch. He had spoken her name loudly enough for the posse to hear, had essentially confirmed her presence to the men who had come to take her. But there was something in his voice that made her wait, made her trust that he had a reason for the apparent betrayal. "I know you're listening," Jonas continued, his rifle still trained on Morrison. "And I want you to understand something before this goes any further." Sheriff Morrison had gone very still, his predatory smile returning as he realized that his quarry was indeed present. "Miss Whitmore," he called out, "why don't you save everyone a lot of trouble and come out here? We just want to talk." Jonas ignored the sheriff completely, his attention focused on the house where Clara stood frozen with indecision. When he spoke again, his words were clearly meant for her alone, despite the audience armed men. If they're here for you, then staying means you've chosen me. The words hit Clara like a physical blow, stealing her breath with their simple truth. He wasn't asking her to surrender or to hide. He was asking her to choose, between the safety of giving up and the danger of standing with him. Between the certainty of facing her past alone and the unknown risk of building a future together. Clara felt the world narrow to that single moment of decision. Through the window, she could see the dust motes dancing in the morning sunlight, could hear the restless shifting of the horses and the quiet breathing of men preparing for violence. Everything hung in perfect balance, waiting for her choice. She thought of Millbrook, of the whispered accusations and pointing fingers that had driven her into the desert. She thought of the banker's son and his convenient lies, of Sheriff Morrison and whatever arrangement had brought him so far from his jurisdiction. She thought of the life she had left behind, comfortable perhaps, but built on the approval of people who had proven themselves capable of cruelty when it suited their purposes. Then she thought of Jonas, of morning coffee shared in comfortable silence and the slow miracle of trust rebuilt one careful day at a time. She thought of the man who had offered shelter without questions, who had shared his stories despite the cost, who was now prepared to risk everything rather than give her up to face injustice disguised as law. Clara stepped away from the door and moved back to the window. Sheriff Morrison was watching the house with predatory intensity, waiting for her to emerge. The deputies had completed their positioning, creating a loose circle around the farmyard that would make escape nearly impossible. But Jonas stood in the center of it all, solid and unmoving, his rifle ready and his gray eyes fixed on Morrison with unwavering determination. He had made his choice, Clara realized. Had made it the moment he refused to confirm her presence, had confirmed it when he refused to step aside. Now it was her turn. Clara moved to the door again, but this time she opened it with steady hands. She stepped onto the small porch, blinking in the bright morning sunlight as 5 pairs of eyes fixed on her with varying degrees of satisfaction and calculation. Sheriff Morrison's smile was triumphant. "Miss Clara Whitmore, I presume. You've led us quite a chase, young lady." Clara ignored him completely, her attention focused on Jonas. He had turned slightly at her emergence, and she could see the question in his eyes, not surprise at her appearance, but a need to know what her presence meant. "I choose you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the farmyard. "Whatever happens next, I choose you." Jonas's expression transformed, the careful mask falling away to reveal something raw and powerful that made Clara's knees weak. For just a moment, the armed men surrounding them ceased to exist. There was only Jonas and Clara and the space between them that hummed with shared determination. Then reality reasserted itself as Sheriff Morrison drew his gun, the metallic sound sharp and final in the morning air. "That's real touching," Morrison said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But this little reunion is over. Miss Whitmore, you're under arrest for the theft of $800 from the Millbrook First National Bank. You're coming with us." Clara lifted her chin, meeting Morrison's gaze with steady eyes. "I never stole anything from anyone, Sheriff. And I think you know that. What I know is that you fled town the same night the money went missing. What I know is that you had access to the bank through your association with young Thomas Hartwell. What I know is that a jury will find that evidence pretty compelling." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Thomas Hartwell, the banker's son who had seduced and abandoned her, had stolen money from his own father's bank and used Clara's flight as the perfect cover for his crime. By the time anyone discovered the theft, she was already gone, making her the obvious suspect. It was elegant in its simplicity and utterly vicious in its cruelty. They hadn't just destroyed her reputation and driven her from her home, they had also set her up to take the blame for their own crimes. "You can't prove any of that," Clara said, though they both knew proof was irrelevant. Morrison hadn't come this far to worry about legal niceties. "Don't have to prove it out here," Morrison replied. "Just have to bring you back to stand trial. What happens during the journey?" He shrugged eloquently. Jonas's rifle swung toward Morrison with fluid grace. "She's not going anywhere with you. Son, you're already in more trouble than you can handle. Don't make it worse. Can't get much worse than watching an innocent woman disappear into the desert with 5 men who've already decided she's guilty." Morrison's mask of official propriety finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "You don't know what you're dealing with here, farmer. This woman is trouble, and anyone who stands with her is going to find himself in the same hole she's dug for herself. Maybe, Jonas said, but that's my choice to make. The standoff stretched taut between them, neither side willing to back down. Clara found herself caught between terror and admiration as she watched Jonas face impossible odds with the same steady determination he brought to coaxing crops from reluctant soil. Then one of the deputies made a mistake. Perhaps nervous from the tension, perhaps eager to end the confrontation, he shifted his position too obviously, bringing his gun to bear on Jonas's back. Jonas saw the movement in his peripheral vision and spun toward the new threat, his rifle tracking the deputy's motion with practiced efficiency. The shot he fired took the man's center mass, dropping him from his saddle with a wet thud that seemed to echo across the prairie. Chaos erupted in the farmyard. The remaining deputies opened fire, their shots splintering wood and shattering glass as Jonas dove for the cover of a water trough. Clara threw herself back into the house, pressing against the wall as bullets punched through the door where she had been standing moments before. The battle was brief but vicious. Jonas had the advantage of position and cover, but he was outnumbered 4-1. Clara watched through the window as he methodically returned fire, each shot placed with the careful precision of a man who had learned to make every bullet count. Another deputy fell, clutching his shoulder as his horse bolted. Sheriff Morrison was shouting orders, trying to coordinate his men while staying out of Jonas's line of fire. But the careful positioning they had achieved before the shooting started was breaking down as horses reared and men sought whatever cover they could find. Clara realized that Jonas couldn't win this fight through force of arms. The odds were simply too great, the enemy too numerous, but he might be able to hold them off long enough for something to change, for some opportunity to present itself. That opportunity came sooner than expected. One of the deputies, emboldened by the apparent stalemate, made a run for the house. He sprinted across the open ground, counting on speed and his companions covering fire to get him to the porch. He almost made it. Jonas's shot caught him in the leg, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground mere feet from Clara's hiding place. The man's gun skittered across the porch, coming to rest near the door where Clara crouched. Without thinking, Clara lunged forward and grabbed the weapon. It was heavier than she had expected, the metal cold and alien in her hands. She had never fired a gun in her life, had never imagined herself capable of violence. But as she looked through the window at Jonas crouched behind his meager cover, facing impossible odds because he had chosen to protect her, she felt something fierce and primitive rise in her chest. The wounded deputy was trying to crawl toward his fallen weapon, leaving a trail of blood across the wooden planks. Clara stepped onto the porch, the gun trembling in her hands but pointed steadily at the man's head. "Don't," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Don't move." The deputy looked up at her with pain-clouded eyes, and Clara saw her own desperation reflected in his expression. They were all trapped now, she realized, victims of circumstances that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Sheriff Morrison saw her emerge with the gun and cursed viciously. "God damn it, woman, you're just making this worse for everyone." Clara kept the gun trained on the wounded deputy but raised her voice to carry across the farmyard. "It's already as bad as it can get, Sheriff. You came here to kill me, and we both know it." "Nobody has to die here," Morrison called back, though his actions suggested otherwise. "Put down the gun and come with us. We'll make sure you get a fair trial." Clara almost laughed at the absurdity of the promise. "Like you made sure Thomas Hartwell got a fair trial for stealing his father's money? Oh wait, that's right, he didn't need one, because you decided to blame me instead." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Clara saw Morrison's expression tighten with confirmation of her suspicions. She had guessed correctly about the source of the stolen money and the reason for her convenient framing. "You don't understand the situation," Morrison said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I understand it perfectly," Clara replied. "Thomas stole the money and needed someone to blame. I was already ruined, already gone. The perfect scapegoat. But you made one mistake, Sheriff." "What's that?" Clara smiled grimly. "You assumed I'd be easy to catch." The brief exchange had given Jonas time to improve his position, moving closer to the house while the sheriff's attention was focused on Clara. She could see him now through her peripheral vision, crouched behind a wooden crate that offered better protection than the water trough. "Clara," Jonas called softly, "the root cellar. Remember what I told you about the root cellar?" Clara nodded slightly, understanding his meaning. If this battle turned against them, if the odds finally proved too great, she could still escape. Could disappear underground while he held them off, emerging only after the danger had passed. But the thought of abandoning Jonas to face Morrison's guns alone was unbearable. She had already chosen him, had already committed herself to whatever fate awaited them. Running now would make that choice meaningless. "No," she called back. "We do this together or not at all." Jonas's expression was pained but unsurprised. He had known she would refuse to save herself at his expense, just as she had known he would refuse to give her up to Morrison's justice. They were bound now by more than affection or shared loneliness. They were bound by the terrible intimacy of choice, by the knowledge that each had been willing to sacrifice everything for the other. Sheriff Morrison seemed to sense that the dynamic had shifted, that his quarry was no longer simply trying to escape, but was prepared to fight. His next words carried a new edge of frustration and barely controlled violence. "Last chance!" he shouted. "Throw down your weapons and surrender, or we'll end this the hard way." Clara looked across the farmyard at Jonas, seeing in his gray eyes the same grim determination she felt in her own chest. They had been given a choice between surrender and defiance, between safety and principle. And they had both made the same decision. "Go to hell, Morrison," Jonas called back, his rifle already tracking toward the sheriff's position. The final assault began with a fury that dwarfed the earlier skirmish. Morrison and his remaining deputies opened fire from multiple positions, their shots coordinated and deadly. Jonas returned fire with methodical precision, but Clara could see that he was being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of lead flying in his direction. She tried to help, firing the wounded deputy's gun at Morrison's position, but her inexperience showed. The shots went wide, serving only to announce her position to the enemy. Morrison quickly shifted his attention to her, his bullets splintering the porch around her feet. Clara threw herself back into the house, her heart hammering as she realized how close she had come to death. Through the window, she could see Jonas's situation deteriorating. His cover was being systematically destroyed by concentrated fire, and it was only a matter of time before a lucky shot found its mark. Then, just as defeat seemed inevitable, Clara heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses approaching fast from the west. At first, she feared it was reinforcements for Morrison, more lawmen come to join the hunt. But as the riders crested the hill overlooking the farmyard, Clara saw that they wore different uniforms entirely. Federal marshals, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Sheriff Morrison saw them too, and his expression shifted from confidence to alarm. Federal marshals meant federal authority, meant someone with jurisdiction that superseded his own, meant questions he might not be able to answer. The lead marshal raised his hand, calling for a ceasefire that echoed across the farmyard with the force of absolute authority. "This is U.S. Marshal William Hayes. Everyone put down your weapons. Now!" The shooting stopped as if a switch had been thrown. Morrison and his surviving deputies looked uncertain, caught between their original mission and the sudden appearance of federal law enforcement. Jonas kept his rifle ready but held his fire, waiting to see what this new development might bring. Marshal Hayes dismounted with the confident ease of a man accustomed to taking charge of chaotic situations. He surveyed the farmyard with professional assessment, taking in the wounded deputy, the defensive positions, the obvious signs of a prolonged gun battle. "Sheriff Morrison," Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition and disapproval, "you're a long way from your jurisdiction." Morrison straightened, trying to regain his official composure. "Marshal Hayes, we're in pursuit of a fugitive from justice, a woman wanted for theft in Millbrook." Hayes nodded slowly. "Yes, I know. Clara Whitmore. That's why we're here." Clara felt her blood turn to ice. If the federal marshals were also looking for her, then her situation had just become exponentially worse. She was trapped between Morrison's corrupt justice and Hayes's federal authority with nowhere left to run. But Hayes's next words changed everything. "Miss Whitmore is under federal protection," the marshal said clearly. "She's a witness in an ongoing investigation of banking fraud and conspiracy. Any attempt to harm or intimidate her is a federal crime." Clara felt the world spin around her. Federal protection? She was a witness? What investigation? Morrison's face had gone pale. "I don't know what you're talking about, Marshal. We have a valid warrant for her arrest." Hayes smiled thinly. A warrant issued by Judge Harrison, I believe. The same Judge Harrison who's currently under federal investigation for accepting bribes and perverting justice. The same Judge Harrison whose son-in-law happens to be the president of Millbrook First National Bank. The web of corruption was finally being exposed, Clara realized. The federal government had been investigating the very people who had destroyed her life, and her flight from Millbrook had apparently triggered their interest in her case. "You have no authority here," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I have all the authority I need," Hayes replied, producing a document from his vest. "Federal warrant for your arrest, Sheriff Morrison, on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and violation of civil rights under federal statute. You and your men will surrender your weapons and submit to custody." The remaining deputies looked to Morrison for guidance, but found only a man whose world was collapsing around him. The careful conspiracy that had seemed so bulletproof was unraveling with devastating speed. Clara emerged from the house slowly, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Jonas rose from his defensive position, his rifle still ready but no longer pointed at immediate threats. The farmyard that had been a battleground moments before was transforming into something resembling a courtroom. "Miss Whitmore," Marshal Hayes called out, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Clara shook her head, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She was alive, she was free, and the men who had destroyed her life were finally being held accountable for their crimes. "Good," Hayes continued. "We'll need your testimony about the events in Millbrook, particularly regarding Thomas Hartwell's theft of bank funds and the subsequent cover-up. Your willingness to come forward will be crucial to securing convictions." Clara found her voice at last. "I'll testify," she said clearly. "I'll tell the truth about everything that happened." Morrison made one last desperate play, his hand moving toward his gun. But Jonas was faster, his rifle swinging around to cover the corrupt sheriff before the man's weapon cleared leather. "I wouldn't," Jonas said quietly. "You've caused enough trouble for one day." Morrison's hand fell away from his gun, defeat written clearly across his features. The federal marshals moved in to secure the prisoners, their efficiency speaking of long practice in handling such situations. As the immediate danger passed, Clara found herself looking across the farmyard at Jonas. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Relief, certainly, but also something else. Something that looked almost like loss. She walked toward him slowly, aware that they were no longer alone, no longer isolated in their valley sanctuary. The world had found them again, had reasserted its claim on their attention and their future. "It's over," she said when she reached him. Jonas nodded, but didn't set down his rifle. "The shooting's over. But you're a federal witness now, Clara. That changes things." She understood his meaning. As a protected witness, she would have obligations, responsibilities that might take her away from the farm. The federal marshals would want her testimony. The courts would want her presence. The quiet life they had been building together was about to be interrupted by the demands of justice. "I'll have to go with them," she said, the words bitter in her mouth. "For a while, probably." Clara looked around the farmyard, taking in the damage from the gun battle, the blood on the wooden planks, the shattered windows that would need repair. It looked like a war zone, not the peaceful sanctuary where she had found healing and hope. "What will you do while I'm gone?" she asked. Jonas was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality she remembered from their earliest encounters. "Same thing I did before you came. Work the land, tend the animals, keep to myself." The words stung because they seemed to dismiss everything that had grown between them, reducing their connection to a temporary arrangement that could be set aside when convenience demanded. But Clara could see the pain beneath Jonas's careful words, could recognize the defensive walls he was rebuilding even as she watched. "Jonas," she said softly. He looked at her then, and Clara saw in his eyes the same fear she felt in her own chest. Fear that the world's intrusion would destroy what they had built, that the demands of justice would prove stronger than the bonds of affection. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't make promises you might not be able to keep." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm not making promises. I'm stating facts. When this is over, when I've testified and done whatever the federal government needs me to do, I'm coming back." "Are you? Really?" Or are you going to discover that there's a bigger world out there with more opportunities than a broken-down farm in the middle of nowhere can offer? The question revealed the depth of his insecurity, the fear that had been growing since Marshall Hayes announced her protected status. Jonas was already preparing himself for abandonment, already building the walls that would protect him when she inevitably chose a different life. "There is no bigger world for me," Clara said fiercely. "There's only this one, the one we built together. The one where I learned who I really am instead of what other people wanted me to be." Jonas studied her face, searching for signs of deception or self-delusion. But Clara met his gaze steadily, pouring all her conviction into her expression. "You'll change your mind," he said eventually. "When you see what else is possible, what kind of life you could have away from here." "No," Clara replied. "I won't, because I've already found what I was looking for." Marshall Hayes approached them before Jonas could respond, his expression respectful but businesslike. "Miss Whitmore, we need to escort you to Denver for debriefing and witness protection. The trial preparations will take several weeks, possibly months," Clara nodded, having expected as much. "I understand. When do we leave?" "Within the hour. We want to get you somewhere safe before word of Morrison's arrest spreads." An hour. Clara felt her chest tighten as she realized how little time she had to say goodbye, to convince Jonas that her departure was temporary rather than permanent. "I need a few minutes," she said to Hayes, "to gather my things." The marshal nodded. "Of course. But please be quick." Clara turned back to Jonas, seeing in his expression the same desperation she felt. An hour to somehow compress everything they needed to say to each other. Everything.